Hello everyone, I'm Kana Taku. I've been studying post-traumatic growth for almost 2 decades now, and I've noticed that we might have focused on cognitive factors a bit too much and somewhat neglected the roles of emotional factors. So today, I want to focus on guilt and shame in relation to PTG because I feel like they have been historically understudied despite their importance to clinical application. We often see in the literature guilt and shame almost as a set pair of negative self-conscious emotions due to their perceived overlap. Guilt and shame are likely to be evoked in situations where a person's thoughts or actions were inconsistent with their own moral standards. However, guilt and shame have very different characteristics. A researcher, Brené Brown, explains the difference between guilt as I did something bad and shame as a feeling that I am bad. So I'll be taking the next few minutes to explore both guilt and shame and their relevance to PTG, along with my current hypothesis. First, although guilt has historically had negative connotations, research has shown that it can be adaptive. Guilt can only be evoked when we have some kind of belief about how we should have felt, thought, or done differently. Without the guidance of a moral code, guilt would be impossible to experience. This type of emotion may lead to deliberate, constructive rumination, which we know is a strong predictor of post-traumatic growth, according to the PTG theory. In fact, one study that was conducted longitudinally by Dr. Sharon Decker and her colleagues with the sample of Israel combat veterans showed positive correlations between guilt and PTG 5 years later. In other words, PTG was facilitated by trauma-related guilt, at least with these combat veterans. Secondly, shame, unlike guilt, has been known to be maladaptive due to the self-criticizing view of themselves as a whole rather than a specific action. Shame leads people to feeling unworthy of being loved, respected, or even alive in this world. This leads to a cycle of additional pain and subsequent destructive behaviors. This type of emotion may lead to intrusive rumination when thoughts occur unbidden and unwanted, and we know that intrusive rumination on its own is not always a positive predictor of PTG without an intentional conversion to deliberate rumination, which is key to the awareness for PTG. In point of fact, a study done by Dr. Tiara Willie and her colleagues showed negative correlations between shame and PTG among people living with HIV and prior childhood sexual abuse. This means that PTG might have been suppressed by a sense of shame with their data. But on the other hand, I recently found a very interesting study that was conducted by Dr. Brian Licko and his colleagues. They ran a series of studies and revealed that when people record experiences of shame, guilt, or embarrassment, the motivation for self-change was most strongly predicted by shame. This is very surprising, but I really like that. They explained these results by indicating that when a specific action provokes guilt rather than shame, apologies and reparations can follow, which may lead the person to feel that they have paid their debt and are therefore off the hook. These rituals of self-forgiveness perhaps allow people to close the book on a bad chapter and therefore may not lead to further self-evaluation of core beliefs or fundamental changes in the same way that shame does, with its focus on core identity. So these researchers found that the sense of shame indicated a motivation for change. Their study is very inspiring, but we just have to keep in mind that their study focused on motivation for change rather than the actual experience of change. Well, after reviewing all of these studies, I wonder if we could use a quadripolar or 2x2 model of shame and guilt to hypothesize their relationships with PTG in order to design a new study. Number 1. High levels of both guilt and shame may lead to subsequent growth, but with the curvilinear, inverted U-shaped relationship. If guilt and shame are really severe, they are not going to allow us to recognize our own personal growth or any positive change as a result of trauma or any transgression. High guilt with a low level of shame may lead to a high level of personal growth, being consistent with the findings from the combat veteran study done by Dr. Sharon Deco. Number 3, high shame with a low level of guilt may lead to a low level of growth. This is consistent with the study done by Dr. Tiara Willie with people living with HIV and childhood sexual abuse, although not quite consistent with the motivation to change study by Dr. Brown Lico. So I have to think about this one a bit more. Number 4, low levels of both guilt and shame may indicate that these people have perhaps fortunately a capacity to integrate the experience into who they are, and so they do not feel the need to struggle or change. This, I would say, resiliency may inhibit their desire for change. Of course, we need to keep in mind that this all depends on the type of life event people experienced. The responses of guilt and shame will vary depending on the circumstance, thought, or action that caused them. For example, the consequences of reckless driving will be very different than those of people who have inappropriate thoughts, marital infidelity, or medical mishaps, and so forth. Hope you find this video interesting. Thank you for watching. Hit thumbs up. I'll see you soon.